Today it's time to dive into the archaeology of the New World and begin trying to get a handle on just what happened and why. The obvious place to begin is at the beginning, and we'll start by looking at the earliest humans to inhabit the continent. Human beings evolved in Africa over the last several million years. About 2 million years ago, human ancestors migrated out of Africa into the rest of the Old World, and by maybe 50,000 years ago, all of the habitable areas of Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia were occupied. But human beings didn't enter the Western Hemisphere until much later. Abundant archaeological and physical anthropological evidence indicates that humans first colonized North America from Siberia by crossing the Bering Land Bridge, sometime before 15,000 years ago or so. During this period, the Earth was in the long-term cooling trend called the Pleistocene epoch, or more colloquially, the Ice Age. For close to 2 million years, average global temperatures had been much lower than they are today, and consequently, much of the northern hemisphere was covered by massive continental glaciers. Tying all that water up in ice sheets meant that global sea levels dropped significantly. The shallow Bering Sea that connects the northern Pacific with the Arctic Ocean dried up. This created a broad, flat area of tundra known as Beringia. While we tend to talk about Beringia as a land bridge made by drying up the Bering Sea, it wasn't narrow and it wasn't muddy. At its widest point, Beringia was 930 miles wide, and it had been permanently dry for thousands of years. The first Native Americans crossing Beringia, perhaps 17,000 years ago, would likely have never even noticed they were moving from one continent to another. When did this crossing happen? The land bridge was opened and closed at various points during the Pleistocene as temperatures varied slightly. It opened most recently about 22,000 years ago, and the Bering Strait flooded again about 15,000 years ago. So a decent estimate for the first humans to cross into North America might be about 17,000 BP, that is, before present. We call these earliest Native Americans Paleoindians, for lack of a better term. There are several very interesting archaeological sites throughout the Western Hemisphere that scholars have suggested are older than this dating, which of course would indicate that humans migrated to the West earlier than thought. Most of these sites are very questionable, however, and the early dates are likely wrong. Right now, the earliest widely accepted Paleo-Indian site is at Monte, Verde, Chile, which dates to 14,900 BP. This would give humans a couple thousand years to migrate from Alaska to Chile, a distance of about 10,000 straight-line miles. That's a perfectly doable pace of migration, a few miles per year. Of course, that distance would vary quite a bit depending on the route Paleo-Indians took to populate the Western Hemisphere, and scholars are by no means agreed on what that route was. There are two main contenders, called the coastal and inland routes. The coastal route, of course, would follow the western coast of North America, southward from Beringia, moving along the coast in small vessels, setting ashore in the small areas that weren't covered by ice, then moving eastward into the interior only when migrants were south of the ice sheets. The inland route follows a narrow corridor between two ice sheets that would lead from interior Alaska through western Canada down into what is now the Great Plains. South of the ice sheets, settlement may have followed a combination of coastal and inland routes as Paleo-Indians moved southward through Mesoamerica into South America. Unfortunately, there simply aren't enough archaeological sites of this very early period to distinguish between the two theories. Most Paleo-Indian sites date thousands of years after this initial colonization. Right now, we have to just suspend judgment and wait for future discoveries. The Pleistocene ended about 12,000 years ago with the onset of a long-term warming trend that ultimately melted the continental glaciers and started the current Holocene epoch. So by the time that humans entered into North America, the Ice Age was already ending and the environment was changing. Not long after, the current environmental and climatic regime settled in. The conditions in much of North America have remained largely the same ever since. Even so, the very first Paleo-Indians in the New World were still dealing with the last remains of the Ice Age environments. Because we'll be looking at the archaeology of the eastern woodlands in the next unit, in this lecture we'll focus on the Paleo-Indian period in North America. Similar sorts of developments happened in other parts of the New World, adjusted for the different landscapes, of course. Your textbook covers this material quite well in the suggested readings. Though Paleo-Indian is the general term for all Native American cultures from this period, the earliest recognizable archaeological culture in the eastern woodlands is known as Clovis, a particular Paleo-Indian culture distinct from, for example, those people at Monte Verde. Clovis is the first culture in the eastern woodlands, but it ranged geographically across much of what is today the continental U.S. The type site, the one for which the culture is named, is in New Mexico. Clovis is recognized as a culture especially by its distinctive fluted spear points. Clovis sites begin showing up across much of the U.S. around about 13,400 BP. Some eastern woodland sites, such as Topper in South Carolina and Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, have been suggested to be pre-Clovis, but these are still debated. Right now it looks like the first people in the eastern woodlands were Clovis people, entering from the west about 13,400 BP. What were their lives like? As the Ice Age environment changed into the modern environment, it became very patchy. Bits of forest were scattered among stretches of grassland and swampy marshes. Remember, there were gigantic melting glaciers just to the north. This environment, coupled with the fact that the Clovis people were hunter-gatherers with extremely low population density, can give us a sense of how they probably structured their communities. Clovis peoples, and probably all Paleo-Indians and later Archaic cultures, were bands. Each community consisted of, at most, a couple dozen people, and relationships among them were egalitarian. They moved frequently, as a group, from one temporary camp to another, probably across very large distances. Some Clovis stone tools are made from materials only available hundreds of miles away from where they were found. While no hunter-gatherer community can survive exclusively on hunting, we have hardly any data on how Clovis peoples made use of plant foods. There simply aren't many preserved plant remains on sites that are so old. Consequently, our understanding of Clovis subsistence has traditionally focused on them as hunters, and big game hunters in particular. Since the Folsom site was excavated in New Mexico in the 1920s, it has been known that Clovis hunters killed large Pleistocene Megafauna, large animals who had evolved during the Ice Age, when large bodies and thick coats of fur and fat were advantageous. The most famous are the mastodon and mammoth, two closely related species whose ranges extended into North America. But there were also giant ground sloths, bison, a species of horse, and several others. That evidence is also found in the eastern woodlands. For example, at Kimmswick, Missouri, where mastodons were butchered with the distinctive Clovis points. The Pleistocene Megafauna are all now extinct. They were already in decline as the climate warmed at the end of the Ice Age. Large animals reproduce slowly, and comparatively quick climate changes like that don't allow them to adapt to new, warmer temperatures. However, these megafauna also went extinct much more quickly than climate change alone would suggest. Some scholars suggest that it is no coincidence that the extinctions happened just as Clovis hunters started exploiting those species. The so-called Overkill Hypothesis says this: Paleo-Indians were excellent hunters. These animals had evolved without humans, so they weren't particularly wary of them. The Paleo-Indians hunted the trusting megafauna to extinction. Humans killed them off faster than they could adapt to the new climate. Every North American species over 1 ton went extinct, and half of those over 70 pounds did, within a couple thousand years of humans entering the Western Hemisphere. The reasons for this are obvious. Large animals are easily located sources of a lot of food. The problem is that something that big is hard to kill. Without sophisticated hunting technology like horses and guns, the easiest way to kill a large-bodied herbivore is to cause the whole herd to stampede off a cliff, or into a marsh where they will bog down and be easy to spear. But then you've just killed a whole herd. There's more food than your small community could ever eat before it rots. That doesn't seem like a problem, however, since there are still thousands of animals alive. In the short term, no single hunter sees the waste as a problem, but extended across a couple thousand years and coupled with climate change, the end effect is extinction. So, roughly 8,000 BC, give or take, the environment has completely shifted to the modern regime. The megafauna are gone entirely, and Native American cultures have to adjust to a new, more stable world. This is the beginning of the very long Archaic period, an extended time of mobile hunting and gathering, during which they spread out to fill just about every habitable portion of the Americas. Again, comparable changes set in elsewhere in the New World as Native Americans adjust to the new environmental conditions, but we'll focus on North America here. So what did this new archaic strategy look like? With the megafauna gone, subsistence shifted to a broader spectrum of foods, both wild plant foods and smaller game. Macrofauna, most importantly the white-tailed deer and large waterfowl like ducks, made up most of the protein. Microfauna, squirrels and rabbits, may have made up a portion of the game, but their bones tend not to survive archaeologically, nor do the traps and snares used to catch them. Of course, it's important to point out that many scholars, Milner in particular in your textbook, think this broad-spectrum diet was just as important in the Paleo-Indian period as well, but that this wasn't as archaeologically visible. There's really no good way to tell right now. Of course, there's no reason to suspect that a Clovis hunter would pass up an easily killed white-tailed deer in preference of a tough-to-kill mastodon. As the Archaic passed, population densities increased, and people filled in the landscape. Hunter-gatherer bands were no longer able to move around as much because they'd be encroaching on the territories of other bands and abandoning their own territories. During the early Archaic, we can see an increase in the number of archaeological sites and in the regional distinctiveness of their artifacts. During the Clovis culture, the Clovis Point was found from the southwest to the northeast. Nothing is that widespread during the early Archaic. The Archaic is thus a period of settling in, when hunter-gatherers were becoming more local and more knowledgeable about their immediately local environment. Rather than following particular food sources around the landscape, they began exploiting a wide array of varying resources that essentially came to them as the seasons changed. Some early Archaic sites are large scatters of many kinds of artifacts, where the same site was reoccupied regularly over many years and many different activities took place. Others are small scatterings of only a few artifacts, where one or two very specific activities took place before the site was abandoned entirely. The Paleo-Indians had been foragers with high residential mobility. Archaic groups transitioned to collecting with higher logistical mobility. What does that mean? Well, there are, generally speaking, two broad strategies for extracting wild foods from the environment, and each of them has a distinctive settlement pattern associated with it. The first strategy works best when the landscape is fairly homogeneous. Many food sources are scattered about the landscape in the same general location. The patchy Paleo-Indian environment was like this. Many small patches relatively close to one another. In this case, the best strategy for a hunter-gatherer band is foraging and residential mobility. Now, my definition of foraging is the process of going out each day and gathering enough food from the immediate vicinity to last the day. When the food sources are depleted in the immediate vicinity, the whole band moves together and establishes a living camp elsewhere. This is residential mobility, the moving of one's residence regularly. All Clovis sites look more or less alike. The opposite kind of environment, in Inuit or Siberian territory, say, is heterogeneous. There are huge individual packets of food, for example polar bears, whales, and so on, but they're widely scattered on the landscape and comparatively hard to locate. In this case, the best strategy is collecting and logistical mobility. Collecting is the process of gathering much more food than you can immediately use, then storing it for future use. Since food is stored, people tend not to move their place of residence as often. Doing so would mean either transporting a lot of food or abandoning it. Instead, the Inuit go in for logistical mobility. A small group of people, only part of the household, leaves their residence for several days or weeks, travels to a distant location where they collect the food, and return it to the base camp. In the eastern woodlands after the Ice Age, the landscape was a mixture of the two extremes. During parts of the year, food was available in abundance relatively nearby, even if the patches were much larger than they had been earlier. During the winter, though, food was widely scattered. So archaic hunter-gatherers developed a combination of residential and logistical mobility, moving their residential base camp a couple times a year, but sending out logistical parties to gather resources in between residential moves. The large multi-purpose archaic sites were base camps, while the tiny ephemeral camps were logistical sites for hunting, fishing, nut collecting, and so on. In Mesoamerica and South America, the landscape was less patchy, or rather the patches were much larger. These regions were becoming increasingly arid and desert was expanding. Thus, residential mobility remained high in these regions, with people moving frequently to exploit resources that were more widely scattered. In the eastern woodlands, however, the strategy allowed Native Americans to develop an intimate knowledge of the landscape. Early archaic hunter-gatherer bands laid the groundwork for their descendants to achieve what's called primary forest efficiency, the efficient exploitation of forest resources to provide a comparatively easy lifestyle. They entered a stable, sustainable relationship with their environment that probably explains the stability of the archaic population over the next several thousand years. Things did change, though, and after next week's exam, we'll look at developments in later periods in the eastern woodlands.